So hi everybody, my name's Cameron, and for my hot topic presentation, I wanted to talk about vitamin D, and in particular, its function within the brain. So to provide a bit of background information on vitamin D, it's one of the four fat-soluble vitamins, which means that it can be stored either in adipose tissue or in the liver. It can also be produced endogenously in response to ultraviolet light, which is really interesting. It's actually called the sunshine vitamin. So if you live somewhere that has a lot of sun exposure, you're not likely to have, problems getting enough vitamin D throughout the day. But in places where you have a lot of cloud coverage on average, for instance, like Ireland, um, you're much more susceptible to developing a vitamin D deficiency. And what we know about vitamin D is that deficiency is extremely common. Vitamin D deficiency is actually one of the most common nutritional deficiencies just in general. Um, but we do know that some groups of people are much more susceptible to that deficiency than others. Um, so aside from the climate related one, people who have darker colored skin, as a result of the pigmentation, it makes it more difficult for your body to respond to that sunlight as it comes down. Um, you have receptors in your skin that detect that sunlight. And if you have a darker pigment, um, it makes it more challenging to convert that vitamin D precursor we have in our skin into the next stage. Um, Another group of people who are quite susceptible to vitamin D deficiency are people who are vegan or vegetarian. And the reason for that is because vitamin D is found in our diets almost exclusively in animal products. So if you're somebody like a vegan, for instance, who doesn't have animal products, you're very likely to have a deficiency. And just in general, people who rely almost on that sunlight to get them the vitamin D they need, just in general, are very likely to have a deficiency to this as well. But moving on, so vitamin D is involved with the brain. Didn't know that. That's something I didn't know either. So that's totally cool. Turns out it is. I was interested in this topic at first because I was curious to see whether vitamin D deficiency was associated with seasonal affective disorder called SAD. And what I know about SAD is that it's like a variation of depression that only manifests itself in certain seasons, typically winter. So I was curious to see if vitamin D had anything to do with that. And I found out that there's a lot of research surrounding how vitamin D is involved with the brain. So as an example of that research, some researchers found out that rats who had vitamin D deficient diets were more likely to have abnormal brain growth. So the brain literally got larger, but it wasn't becoming any more dense in terms of synapses. It was almost just like empty space. Children with vitamin D deficient mothers are more likely to develop schizophrenia later in life. As it turns out, vitamin D deficiency is also associated with other mental health conditions such as depression and seasonal affective disorders. So that's definitely a trend. Next question is, why should you care? And I think the reason you should care is because there's real potential for vitamin D to actually play a role in treating mental illness. And the reason for that is because vitamin D actually has a lot of interactions with the brain. So as an example, seasonal affective disorder has a lot in common with vitamin D function. So as an example, we know that vitamin D levels decline during the winter months as a result of decreased sunlight. We know that SAD is something that typically happens in the winter. We know that vitamin D levels in the brain are especially high in the hippocampus, and that's a part of the brain that is heavily involved with the circadian rhythm process. And people who have SAD are much more likely to have circadian rhythm dysfunction. And finally, vitamin D levels play a role in the production of both serotonin and dopamine. And those are both neurotransmitters which are believed to be heavily involved with depression. So those are kind of reasons to believe, that supplementation for people with mental health disorders could be something that could be therapeutic. So the next question is, where do we go from here? So what currently has happened is there's been a few studies on humans where researchers have basically assigned them into control and experimental groups where they gave them different amounts of vitamin D. And these people were people who had deficiencies in vitamin D. And there's been mixed results so far as to whether or not it's going to result in an increase in your mental state. But that is something that will be investigated hopefully in future studies. We know that vitamin D toxicity is quite rare unless you're somebody who doesn't really take general precautions when going outside in sunny times. So the theory is that it's not going to be a huge concern if you, it's not likely you're going to have a toxicity to it. So the really is like, what's the problem with doing it? We know that vitamin D is not likely to replace standard treatment like antidepressants or counseling when it comes to mental health stuff, but it may be a really useful addition to a regular treatment plan. And I really expect that there's going to be more trials with vitamin D supplementation in the future. And it's something that is only going to continue to grow as we learn more about actually what vitamin D's function in the brain is. And yeah, that's my presentation. Thanks for listening. Awesome.